She rode 300 miles to marry a man she had never met, and arrived to find another woman already wearing the dress. That was the moment Abigail Mercer understood something most people never learn until it is too late. The frontier does not care about your plans. It does not care about your letters, your promises, or the hope you carried folded inside your coat pocket for 6 weeks of hard travel. The frontier simply waits and watches and separates the ones who quit from the ones who don't. Abigail did not quit. If you've ever been counted out before you even had a chance to begin, stay with this story until the very end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The wagon that brought Abigail Mercer to the edge of Harlan County arrived on a Tuesday in late September, when the sky was the color of old tin and the wind carried the first real bite of coming winter. She sat in the back of the freight wagon beside 2 crates of dry goods and a roll of fence wire that had spent the last 40 miles pressing a deep groove into her left hip. She had not complained about the wire. She had not complained about the 2 days of rain before that, or the broken wheel that had cost them 7 hours in a muddy ditch outside of Caldwell, or the way the freighter, a taciturn man named Otis, had looked at her when she first hired him, that sliding sideways look that took in her broad shoulders and her heavy frame and dismissed her somewhere behind his eyes before she had spoken a single word. Abigail was 31 years old and had spent most of those years learning to absorb that particular kind of look without letting it show on her face. She had her trunk, she had her sewing kit, her mother's cast iron skillet wrapped in burlap, a slim folder of documents tied with kitchen twine, and $42.60 sewn into the lining of her wool coat. She also had a letter, 3 pages in careful handwriting, from a man named Randall Holt of Black Ridge Ranch, Harlan County, territory of Kansas, who had placed an advertisement in the Wichita Courier 6 months ago, seeking a capable woman of practical disposition for the purpose of matrimony and the running of a working cattle ranch. Abigail had answered that advertisement. She had answered it after her father's store in Salina closed, and the creditors took the fixtures and the counter and the 2 glass cases she had helped her father build when she was 11 years old. She had answered it after her younger sister Clara married a druggist from Topeka and moved into a yellow house with a porch and an herb garden. She had answered it after one more winter of taking in mending and alterations and listening to women who were smaller and younger talk about their futures, while Abigail hemmed their wedding dresses and said nothing. The correspondence with Randall Holt had lasted 4 months. He was 43, a widower. He had written about his ranch in plain, unlovely sentences. The cattle numbers, the acreage, the 2 hired hands who came and went depending on the season. He had not written poetry or flattery. He had written, "I need someone who is not afraid of work and who can manage a household the way a serious person manages a business." That sentence had struck Abigail as the most honest thing anyone had written to her in years. She had written back in the same vein. She told him what she could do: accounts, preserving, animal care, garden management, basic carpentry repairs, cooking for a working crew. She did not mention what she looked like in the same way he had not mentioned what he looked like, because she understood that what she looked like was not supposed to matter, and because she hoped in the practical and unsentimental part of her heart that had survived everything so far, that it actually would not. By the time the wagon pulled off the main road and onto the rutted track that Otis told her led to Black Ridge Ranch, Abigail had revised her understanding of the word isolated approximately 12 times. The land out here was big in the way that emptied you out. Long rolling prairie grass, limestone outcroppings the color of bleached bone, cottonwood draws running down into shallow creek beds that were half dry by September. There was beauty in it. There was also a loneliness in it so vast that it pressed against the sides of the wagon like a physical weight. The ranch came into view around a low bend, a main house of weathered board and batten, a barn that leaned slightly south, 2 outbuildings, and a fenced yard where 3 chickens were doing whatever chickens did when no one was watching them. It was not prosperous, but it was not ruined either. Abigail looked at it the way she looked at a garment that had been badly stored, not destroyed, just in need of someone who knew what they were doing. She was already calculating the work when she saw the woman on the porch. She was young, not dramatically young, not the kind of young that announced itself, maybe 25, 26. but young in the way that Abigail had not been for some time. She had dark hair pulled loose and a blue calico dress, and she was leaning against the porch post with her arms folded, watching the wagon come up the track with an expression that was careful and unreadable. Beside her stood a man who could only be Randall Holt. He was shorter than his letters had suggested, though Abigail was aware that letters suggested nothing about physical height. He had a reddish beard going gray at the jaw, and he was wearing a good shirt, which meant he had known someone was coming today. He looked at the wagon, he looked at Abigail, and then he looked at the woman in the blue dress, and that look, that brief, involuntary, informative look, told Abigail everything she needed to know before she had climbed down from the wagon seat. She climbed down anyway. She was not a woman who stayed in wagons. "Mr. Holt," she said. Her voice was steady. She had always had a steady voice. It was one of the things she was quietly proud of. "Miss Mercer." He came down the porch steps. He had the look of a man who had been rehearsing something and had now forgotten all of it. I need to explain something to you." "You don't have to explain anything," the woman on the porch said. Not unkindly, almost gently, the way you speak to someone when you feel sorry for them. That was the part Abigail minded most. The woman's name was Doris Cale. She was from a family 2 townships over, and she and Randall Holt had known each other for... Here he stumbled over the timeline in a way that suggested the timeline was recent and complicated. And they had reached an understanding in August, and he had tried to write to Abigail to tell her, he truly had, but the letter must have crossed with her own travel. And he was sorry. He was genuinely sorry. She had come such a long way. Abigail stood in the yard with the wagon behind her and the trunk still in the back, and her $42 sewn into her coat, and listened to Randall Holt apologize. She watched his face while he did it. He was not a cruel man. He was a weak one, which was different, and in some ways harder to be angry at. "I understand," she said when he was finished. "I can pay for your return fare to Selena," he said. "I feel I owe you that much." "You don't owe me anything?" She said it without heat. "We made no legal agreement." The woman, Doris, had come down from the porch now. Up close she was prettier than she had looked at a distance, with direct brown eyes and a quality of steadiness about her that Abigail might have liked under different circumstances. "Do you have somewhere to go?" she asked. It was a reasonable question. It landed like a small stone dropped into still water. "I'll find somewhere," Abigail said. She got back into the wagon. She told Otis to go back to the main road. He did not say anything, for which she was grateful, because she was holding herself very carefully together, and any small act of sympathy might have disturbed the architecture of it. They rode in silence for a mile and a half. The wind had picked up. Out to the west, a line of cloud was building over the flats. "There's another ranch," Otis said eventually. He said it at the sky, not at her. "About 6 miles south, fella named Boone, Silas Boone. You'd have heard of him if you were from around here." A pause. "He's not exactly looking for a wife, but he's running out of time on his mortgage and his place is in rough shape. You might find work there. Cook, housekeeper, whatever." He paused again. "It ain't much of a suggestion." "It's the only one I have," Abigail said. "Take me there." Ost. The road to Silas Boone's ranch was not a road in any formal sense. It was a set of wagon tracks that had been made by habit rather than intention, cutting south through a stretch of short grass prairie where the soil showed through in wide, dry patches. Otis navigated it without complaint, which elevated him somewhat in Abigail's estimation. She used the 6 miles to do 2 things. First, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. The long journey, the careful letters, the hope she had folded up small and carried carefully, now unfolded and exposed as the kind of hope that the world occasionally required you to discard. She let herself feel it, and then she set it aside in the way she had learned to set things aside, which was not the same as forgetting them, but was the necessary practical step that came before moving forward. Second, she began to think. She had $42. She had skills. She had a cast iron skillet and a sewing kit and a mind that was good at organization and pattern and the kind of patient problem solving that most people called stubbornness because they didn't understand it. She had arrived at the frontier expecting a specific future, and that future had closed, and so now she needed to find a different one. The frontier, she told herself, was full of problems. Someone who could solve problems should be able to find a place in it. She was thinking this when the Boone place came into view. Her first thought was that it was worse than she had expected. Her second thought was that her expectations had been pessimistic. Her third thought, the one that settled and stayed, was that it was not beyond recovery. Not yet. The house was a small frame structure with a sagging porch and a front door that hung at a slight angle, suggesting a hinge had given way and been imperfectly repaired. Two of the front-facing windows had been covered with oilcloth instead of glass. The yard between the house and the barn was a study in accumulated neglect. A rusted piece of equipment she couldn't identify from the wagon, a pile of warped boards that might have been a fence section, 3 or 4 feed sacks that had been left out and gone to weather. The barn was in better shape than the house, which told her something about the man who lived here. He prioritized his animals. That was not nothing. Silas Boone came around the side of the barn when he heard the wagon. He was tall, taller than she'd expected from the way Otis had described him, with a kind of rangy looseness to his frame that suggested he had once been heavier and the last year or two had taken it off him. He was maybe 38, 40. His face was angular and weathered and currently arranged in an expression that was not quite a frown, but was the territory adjacent to one. He was wearing a work shirt with the left cuff torn, and his boots were good, but badly in need of resoling. He looked at the wagon. He looked at Otis. He looked at Abigail. "Otis?" he said. "Silas." Otis tilted his head toward Abigail. "Lady here's looking for work. Thought you might be in a position to need some." Silas Boone looked at Abigail with the flat assessment of a man who had not been expecting company and did not have the social energy to pretend otherwise. His eyes moved over her in the same way Otis's had when she'd first hired him, but there was less dismissal in it and more, she searched for the word, wariness, like a man who had learned that unexpected arrivals generally meant new problems. "I can't afford hired help," he said. "I'm not asking for much," Abigail said. She had made the decision somewhere in the last mile to simply be direct, because she didn't have the time or the resources for anything else. "A room and meals for a start. I can cook, keep house, manage supplies. I can look at your books if you have them. I can help you figure out what's bleeding you dry before it gets any worse." "Lady, my name is Abigail Mercer. I came out from Salina on a marriage arrangement that fell through this afternoon. I have nowhere to go tonight, and I have no intention of sleeping in the open. I am offering you labor in exchange for shelter, and I am not asking you to marry me, or trust me, or like me. I am asking you to give me a trial period of 2 weeks and see if I'm useful." Silas Boone stared at her for a long moment. His jaw worked slightly, the way a man's jaw does when he's running through a conversation in his head and finding that none of the responses he's come up with are quite adequate. 2 weeks, he said finally. "There's a room off the kitchen. It's got a cot. That's it." "That's fine. I don't make promises beyond 2 weeks." "Neither do I." He looked at her for one more beat, and then he looked at Otis. "You staying for supper?" "Got to get back before dark," Otis said. He helped Abigail down her trunk without being asked, which raised him another notch in her estimation. He climbed back onto the wagon seat, nodded once to both of them, and drove back up the track without ceremony. Abigail picked up one end of her trunk and looked at Silas. "Where's the kitchen?" she said. The room off the kitchen was exactly what he had said it was. A cot, a small window with actual glass in it, and 4 walls that had been whitewashed at some point so long ago that it had faded to the color of old cream. There was a nail on one wall and nothing else. The cot had a blanket that had been washed so many times it was more thought than fabric. Abigail set her trunk against the wall, hung her coat on the nail, and sat on the edge of the cot for approximately 90 seconds. Then she got up and went to find the kitchen. The kitchen was, in her professional assessment, a disaster. Not dirty. She noted this with some relief, but disordered in the way of a space managed by someone who had been slowly losing the ability to care about management. Things were where they had ended up rather than where they should be. The flour barrel was next to the door instead of near the stove. The coffee grinder was on the floor. There were 3 different pots stacked in a configuration that would require moving all 3 to get to any one of them. The firebox in the stove had been cleaned recently, which was something, and there was a good supply of wood stacked near the back wall, which was more. She found salt pork, dried beans, cornmeal, and 4 eggs. She found an onion that was mostly still good if you cut away the bad part. She found a small pottery jar of lard that was 3/4 full. She made supper. It was not elaborate. Salt pork, bean soup, cornbread in her mother's skillet. She made enough for 2 people, set 2 plates on the table, and called toward the back of the house. Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the table. He looked at her. "You didn't have to do that tonight," he said. "You just got here." "I was hungry," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. They ate in silence for a while, which was a particular kind of silence. Not hostile, but provisional, 2 people making careful assessments of each other without yet having a vocabulary for it. "Where'd you say you were from?" he said finally. "Selena. My father had a dry goods store. He passed, and the store closed." He nodded. The nodding said he knew what that meant without needing the details. "You really came all the way from Selena to marry Randall Holt?" he said. There was no mockery in it. It sounded like a genuine question, the kind you ask when you're trying to understand the shape of how someone ended up in front of you. "I came all the way from Selena to start something new," Abigail said. "Holt was the plan. The plan changed. I'm adapting." Silas looked at her over his bowl. "That's simple?" "It's not simple at all," she said, "but sitting in the road feeling sorry for myself wasn't going to get supper made." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. She would learn that Silas Boone was not much of a smiler, but a small easing of the tension around his eyes, like a knot that had been loosened one turn. "The cornbread's good," he said. "I know it is," she said. She was up before him the next morning, which she suspected he was not accustomed to. She had built up the fire, put the coffee on, and gone out to look at the property in the early gray light while the coffee came to heat. What she saw in daylight was both better and worse than what she had seen arriving in the late afternoon. Better because the land itself was good. The soil in the neglected garden plot was dark and workable, and there was water nearby. She could tell by the vegetation in the low draw to the east. Worse, because the evidence of sustained neglect was more visible in full light. The garden had gone to thistle and volunteer wheat. The chicken coop was leaning badly on its west wall and had a gap in the wire that anything could have gotten through. And the fence line along the south pasture had come down in at least 2 places she could see from here. She was standing at the edge of the garden plot making notes. She had a small notebook she used for accounts and inventory, and she was writing observations in the same systematic way she had once managed her father's stock, when Silas came out of the house with his coffee. He stopped when he saw her with the notebook. "What are you doing?" he said. "Making a list." She didn't look up. "Starting with what can be fixed without spending money. The chicken coop wall needs 2 boards and a handful of nails. The garden needs to be cleared and turned, which is labor but not cost. Your water barrel near the barn has a cracked stave. That's more urgent. You're going to lose water, and if it fails in winter, you'll have a real problem." He walked up beside her and looked at the garden. He had the look of a man reviewing territory he had stopped seeing because he had looked at it too long. "I know about the barrel," he said. "What's the holdup?" A pause. "Been busy." She looked at him then. He was looking at the garden, not at her, and his face had the particular closed quality of a man who was not saying the most important thing. She did not push it. She had learned that you did not push a man like that on the second morning. You waited until there was enough trust built to hold the weight of the real conversation, and you built that trust through small, consistent things that demonstrated you were not going anywhere. "All right," she said. "I'll start with the coop wire today. If you have a hammer and nails somewhere that I can find them." "Barn, left side, top shelf of the workbench." She nodded and went back to her notebook. "The beans from last night," he said. "Is there any left?" "Pot's on the stove. There's enough for breakfast." She heard him go back into the house. She stood in the weed-choked garden with her notebook and the early sun beginning to show itself orange at the horizon line, and she allowed herself one careful look at what she had to work with. It was not much, but it was not nothing. She had learned a long time ago to make the distinction between the two. Okay. The first week went the way first weeks go when 2 strangers are navigating an arrangement neither of them planned for. Carefully, and with a lot of unsaid things accumulating in the space between them. Abigail worked. That was the simplest description and the most accurate. She fixed the chicken coop with boards she found in the scrap pile behind the barn. She cleared half the garden plot and turned the soil until her shoulders ached in a way that was honest and workmanlike, the kind of ache that told you the work had been real. She reorganized the kitchen so that the things you needed were where you could get to them. She found 3 fence posts that had rotted at the base and needed replacement before the next time the cattle tested that line. She wrote all of this down in her notebook in 2 columns. What was done and what remained. She also watched. Watching was something she was good at, and watching Silas Boone was, she found, over the course of that first week, instructive in ways she hadn't anticipated. He was not lazy. That was the first thing she established and held on to, because it mattered. He was out before full light every morning, and he was still working when the sky went dark. But there was something disorganized about it. He moved from task to task in a way that covered a lot of ground without making a lot of progress. The way a man moves when he has too many problems competing for his attention and has stopped being able to prioritize any of them. She had seen this before, in her father, in the last year of the store, when the debt had gotten bad enough that it stopped feeling like a problem to be solved and started feeling like weather, something you just lived inside of. She was thinking about this on Thursday evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger she had found in the bottom drawer of the desk in what served as Silas's office, a small, dark room off the main hallway with a desk and a single shelf of papers that made her careful accounting instincts wince. Silas came in from outside. He saw her with the ledger and stopped. "I didn't say you could look at that," he said. "No, you didn't." She kept her tone even. "Do you want me to close it?" He stood there for a moment. The lamp was burning low, and the shadows made the angles of his face harder. He looked tired, not the regular tired of a working day, but the deep tired that had been accumulating for longer than one day. "What do you see?" he said. "I see a pattern," she said. "Your operational costs aren't the problem. You're not spending more than you should be. The problem is the note on the property." She tapped the page with her finger. "This interest rate is not legal." He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "Holt's attorney handled it. When Martha died, I needed to refinance and—" He stopped. "Victor Harlan's operation handles lending in this county. I didn't have many choices." "Victor Harlan," she said the name. "The land company." "Land company, lending operation, water rights management." Silas said it with the flat effect of a man reciting facts he had repeated to himself many times in the dark. "He runs most of it. The big operations, anyway." Abigail looked back at the ledger. She did the calculation again in her head, the way she had learned to do it from her father, who had been good at numbers before the debt made him stop looking at them. The figure she arrived at was the same one she'd arrived at 20 minutes ago. "At this rate," she said, "you have approximately 4 months before the foreclosure notice becomes actionable." Silence. "I know," Silas said. "Do you know that the interest he's charging you is 11% above the legal limit set by territorial statute?" Another silence, different in quality from the first one. "No," he said. "I didn't know that." Abigail looked at him. He was looking at the ledger. His expression was not what she expected. Not relief exactly, but something like the look of a man who has been in a dark room for a long time and has just registered that there is a window somewhere. "I'd need to see the original documents," she said. "The deed, the survey, the original mortgage terms. Do you have those?" "There's a box," he said. "In the office. I haven't opened it since Martha died." "Can I open it?" He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the prairie grass with a sound like water, a sound that was the constant low background of this place. "Yeah," he said. "You can open it." She found the box on Saturday morning. It was a wooden document case with a latch that had gone stiff from disuse, and it contained approximately 4 years of paper. Deeds, survey records, receipts, correspondence, the original mortgage instrument from a Wichita bank that had subsequently sold the note to Victor Harlan's company, 2 assessment notices, a letter from the Territorial Land Office dated 3 years ago that Abigail read once and then read again. She sat very still for a moment. Then she went to find Silas. He was in the barn, working with quiet focus on a piece of harness that needed stitching. She stood in the barn door and waited until he looked up. "When was the last time anyone walked the survey line on this property?" she said. He put down the harness. "Martha's father said it back in the 60s. It was surveyed again when I bought out her brother's share, maybe 6 years ago." "Who conducted that survey?" "A man Harlan's company recommended." "Standard process," they said. Abigail held up the letter from the Territorial Land Office. "This is a notice that your survey record was updated in the county register 3 years ago. Did you authorize any update?" He crossed the barn toward her slowly, the way a man crosses a space when he's not sure what he's walking into. He took the letter. He read it. He read it again. "No," he said. "I didn't authorize anything." Abigail nodded. She was holding herself very deliberately calm because what she was beginning to understand was large and had sharp edges, and she needed to think clearly about it before she said anything more. "I need a few more days with these documents," she said, "and I need to write some letters. Will you let me do that?" He looked at her. He had the look now of a man who had been underwater and had just found out that someone else in the water with him knew which direction was up. "Write your letters," he said. She turned back toward the house. Behind her, she heard him say something, quietly, not quite to her. "What?" she said. "I said," Silas repeated, a little louder, "I'm glad Otis brought you here." Abigail kept walking toward the house, but she allowed herself, in the privacy of her own face, the small, complicated thing that was not quite a smile and not quite relief, and was in some ways more important than either. She had a ranch to save. She hadn't known that when she arrived. She was beginning to understand it now. On Sunday evening, she sat at the kitchen table with her notebook, the document case open beside her, and 2 pages of her own notes spread across the lamp circle of yellow light. The coffee was cold. She hadn't noticed. The letter she had found from the Territorial Land Office had been the first thread. Pulling it had started to reveal a larger shape. The survey update 3 years ago was not an isolated event. It corresponded, in a way that Abigail's careful cross-referencing was starting to make visible, with a shift in the property boundary description in the mortgage records. A shift that was small. That looked clerical. That would take someone with an eye for patterns and enough time and stubbornness to notice it for what it was. The eastern boundary of Silas's property, as described in the original deed, ran along the crest of a low limestone ridge. The eastern boundary, as described in the updated survey, ran along the base of that same ridge. The distance between the crest and the base was perhaps 40 yards. Those 40 yards contained the point where the creek that fed the property's main water supply crossed from higher ground. In other words, someone had quietly, carefully, on paper, moved Silas Boone's water off his own land. Abigail wrote that sentence in her notebook and then sat looking at it for a long time. She thought about Victor Harlan, who handled lending and land and water rights in Harlan County. She thought about a man who had found a way to make a struggling rancher's debt grow faster than he could pay it, who had arranged a survey update that the rancher didn't authorize, who had, if she was reading this correctly, arranged things so that the water Silas had been using for 6 years now technically ran through property that could be claimed by someone else. It was, she thought, a very elegant scheme, if you were the kind of person who thought systematic theft was elegant. She closed her notebook and looked at the lamp for a moment. Then she opened it again and began a new page. There were letters to write. There were records to request. There was a man in Wichita who had done the original survey in the 1860s, and if he was still living, she wanted to talk to him. There was the Territorial Land Office itself, which had sent the notification letter that she suspected no one at this ranch had understood the significance of. 4 months. That was what the ledger said. 4 months before Harlan's company could move on the foreclosure. She had worked with less time before. Abigail Mercer picked up her pen and began to write. The letters went out on Monday morning, tucked into Otis's freight wagon when he passed through on his regular Caldwell run. Abigail had written 4 of them. One to the Territorial Land Office in Wichita requesting a copy of the survey update notification and the name of the surveyor who had filed it. One to the original Wichita bank asking for the chain of title documentation on the mortgage transfer to Harlan's company. One to a land records clerk she had found referenced in one of the older documents whose name suggested he might still be in the county system and one to an attorney in Caldwell named Perch, whose advertisement she had seen in an old newspaper she found lining the bottom of the document case. She had not told Silas exactly what was in all 4 letters. She had told him she was following threads, and he had nodded in the way he was beginning to nod when she said things he didn't fully understand but had decided to trust. That trust had not come easily, and she was aware it could still be revoked. It lived in small transactions between them. The way he had started leaving a lamp on if she was still up working when he went to bed. The way he had begun, almost without seeming to notice he was doing it, to ask her opinion before he made decisions about the day's work. He was not a man who had ever asked anyone's opinion easily. She could tell that from the slight tension in him when he did it, like a muscle that had been trained not to do something and was having to unlearn. She didn't make it harder than it needed to be. She answered plainly and moved on. What she was not telling him yet was how bad it looked. Not the debt. He knew the debt. What she was seeing in the documents was something more deliberate than debt, and she wasn't ready to put the whole shape of it in front of him until she had enough to prove it rather than just suspect it. In the meantime, there was work. The garden plot she had cleared and turned in the first week had been planted by Wednesday. Winter wheat in the near section. Garlic set she had found in a dry crock in the cellar, pressed into the soil in long rows at the back. It wouldn't help them this season. It was an act of intention, a statement made to the ground that someone was planning to be here next year. The chicken coop was repaired and producing 6 eggs a day with reasonable consistency. She had found 2 Rhode Island Reds that had been nesting under the barn and added them to the flock, and had argued with herself for 20 minutes before deciding that if Silas objected, she would deal with it then. He didn't object. He noticed the 2 new birds and looked at her with something that was almost amusement. "Found them under the south wall," she said, not waiting for the question. "I know where they were," he said. "Been trying to catch them for 3 months." "You have to approach from the east side. They don't like the light in their faces." She moved on to the water barrel she was in the process of repairing with a soaked willow band and a barrel hoop she had found in the barn. Silas stood there for a moment, looking at the chickens, and she thought she heard him make a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same neighborhood. She had started to learn the geography of him. He was a man who had closed off large portions of himself at some point. She thought it was probably when his wife died, but it may have started before that. And he wore that closure the way he wore his work clothes, so habitually that he probably no longer noticed the weight of it. He was not unkind. He was not cold exactly. He was just reduced, like a fire that had been burning for a long time in a space with insufficient air. She didn't try to open him up. She wasn't his wife, and she wasn't his confessor, and she didn't have time for that project, even if she'd been inclined to attempt it. She just made sure the air was there, and let him figure out the rest. The harder discovery came on Thursday of the second week. She had been following the eastern fence line, the one whose legal description in the updated survey had been troubling her, and she found what she had half expected and half hoped she wouldn't. A section of the original irrigation channel that ran from the creek down toward the lower pasture had been partially filled. Not collapsed. Filled. There was a difference between ground that had shifted and settled over time and ground that had been deliberately disturbed, and Abigail had spent enough time behind her father's store where they'd done some drainage work to know what intentional fill looked like. She stood at the edge of it for a long time. The filled section was maybe 30 feet, enough to break the channel's flow and redirect the water into the shallow depression that ran southeast, which ran, if she was reading the land correctly, off the property's current working boundary and into the draw that Harlan's adjusted survey had effectively placed outside Silas's water claim. It was not an accident. Someone had done this with a shovel and some patience, and they had done it at a point in the channel that was far enough from the main buildings that no one who wasn't walking this fence line specifically would find it easily. She went back to the house and got her notebook. She went back to the channel and made drawings. The fill line, the depth as far as she could assess it by probing with a fence post, the angle of the redirected flow, the distance from the property corner marker to the nearest point of fill. She wrote measurements. She noted the vegetation that had grown over the disturbed soil and made an estimate of how long ago the work had been done based on the root depth of the grass. 2 to 3 years, she estimated, which corresponded almost exactly with the date on the survey update letter. She was crouching in the grass writing this down when she heard boots behind her and looked up to find Silas standing at the edge of the channel. "What happened here?" he said. "Someone filled it," she said. He looked at the channel. He crouched down beside her, closer than he usually positioned himself, and pressed his palm against the soil at the edge of the fill. "This is why the lower pasture went dry," he said. Not a question. He said it quietly, like a man confirming something he had always suspected but never been able to prove. "Yes," Abigail said. "The cattle. I lost 6 head 2 summers ago. I thought it was the drought." His voice had gone flat and thin. "There was a drought," Abigail said, "but your cattle were getting less water than they should have had, even accounting for it." He stood up. He looked out across the pasture toward the east, toward the limestone ridge, toward the boundary that had been quietly moved on paper. "Harlan," he said. "That's what I believe," Abigail said. "But I need more than belief. I need the original survey. I need someone who can verify this fill is artificial and establish when it was done. And I need the attorney in Caldwell to tell me whether what I found in the mortgage documents about the interest rate is what I think it is." Silas turned and looked at her. This close, in the afternoon light, she could see the tightness around his eyes that had been there since she arrived. Not anger exactly, though there was anger underneath it. Exhaustion. The long-term exhaustion of a man who had been losing ground 1 inch at a time and had not understood why. "You think this is real," he said. "You think it's not just... You think someone actually sat down and planned this." "I think someone sat down and planned this very carefully," she said, "over years, and I think you were not the only one." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the grass around them. "Why would you..." He stopped, started again. "You've been here 2 weeks. This is not your problem." Abigail looked at him. She thought about that for a moment, about what the honest answer to that was. "I have nowhere better to be," she said, "and I don't walk away from things I can fix." He held her gaze for a beat, and then he looked away toward the ridge, and she let him. "What do you need me to do?" he said. "Right now? Show me every corner marker on this property, every one you know of. I want to walk the whole boundary line." He nodded. "It'll take most of tomorrow. Then we'll start at first light." They walked the boundary line the next day. All of it, 4 miles of it in total. And Silas talked more in those 4 miles than he had in the combined total of the 2 weeks before. Not about the boundary, or not only about the boundary. He talked about the land the way a man talks about something he has a complicated feeling for, something he loves and has also been failing. His wife, Martha, had grown up on this property. Her father had homesteaded it in '63, had built the house, the original 2 rooms before the addition, with lumber he had freighted from a mill 60 miles east. She had inherited it when her father died and had brought Silas onto it when they married. He had come from Missouri with nothing but good cattle sense and a willingness to work, and they had built it together into something that was not prosperous but was solid and theirs. When she got sick, it was her lungs, a long bad winter followed by a summer that never quite dried out the wet she'd taken in. The ranch had already been struggling. The drought of 2 years prior had hit them hard. He had borrowed against the property to get through it, and the note had ended up with Harlan's company because the original bank had sold their loan portfolio. By the time Martha died, he was already behind. He told all of this without self-pity, which was the only way Abigail could have listened to it. She had small patience for self-pity, in herself or anyone else, but she had a great deal of patience for plain honest accounting, which was what this was. She would have fought it, Silas said, at one point, standing at a corner marker in the southeast, a sandstone post with an old cut mark on the north face. Martha, she wouldn't have just let it happen. You didn't just let it happen, Abigail said, looking at the marker, comparing it to her notebook. You didn't know what was happening. Same result. It's not the same result and it's not the same thing, she said, with more firmness than she usually allowed herself. A man who's tricked is not the same as a man who gives up. Don't confuse those. He looked at her. She was writing in her notebook and didn't look up, but she could feel him looking. You're a fairly direct person, he said. Yes, she said. I'm starting to think that's useful. I've always thought so, she said. The southeast marker was in the right place. It matched the original deed description to the foot. The northeast marker was where the problem was. It was a newer post, iron rather than sandstone, and it sat approximately 38 yards southwest of where the original deed placed the corner. 38 yards. She had brought the original deed language with her, and she stood at that iron post and read the language aloud to Silas. Thence north along the eastern ridge crest to the marked stone at the creek crossing. The marked stone at the creek crossing was 38 yards to the northeast. She could see it from here, half buried in grass, the old cut mark still faintly visible on its face. That post was put there by the surveyor Harlan's company sent, Silas said. He was looking at the iron post the way you look at something you should have questioned a long time ago. Yes, Abigail said, and it moved your northeastern corner 38 yards southwest, which moved your eastern boundary line 38 yards west, which put the creek crossing outside your legal claim. Silas stood very still. Can that be undone? He said. The marker can be challenged. With the original deed, with a survey from a qualified independent surveyor, and with evidence that the change was made without proper legal process. She closed her notebook. That's what we're going to do. Lord. The letter from attorney Gerald Perch of Caldwell arrived on a Friday in the third week, and it was, in Abigail's estimation, the best news she had received since she arrived in Harlan County, which was not a high bar but still counted. Perch confirmed what she had calculated. The interest rate on Silas's mortgage, as amended in the refinancing documents, exceeded the territorial usury limit by 9 percentage points. The excess interest, compounded over the 4 years since the refinancing, represented a figure that, if stripped out of the total debt, reduced what Silas legitimately owed to approximately 40% of what Harlan's company was currently claiming. 40%. The difference between a man losing his ranch and a man who still had a ranch to fight for. She read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and put it in the document case. Then she went to the barn where Silas was working on the roof of the lean-to, up on a ladder with a hammer that he was operating with a controlled ferocity that suggested he had heard about iron fence posts from the previous day enough times in his own head that he needed something to hit. Come down for a minute, she called up. He looked down at her. He read something in her face because he came down. She told him about the letter. She told him the figure. She watched him work through the arithmetic. She could see him doing it, the same way she'd done it, arriving at the same place she'd arrived. You're telling me almost half of what I owe doesn't legally exist, he said. I'm telling you that's what a court would likely find based on Perch's assessment of the territorial statute and what's in your documents. He sat down on the bottom rung of the ladder. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, not in a defeated way, but in the way of a man who needs a moment to absorb a thing that is large. Abigail gave him the moment. When he looked up, something in his face had changed. The deep, exhausted tightness was still there, but beneath it now there was something else. Something that had been absent for long enough that it took her a moment to identify it. It was the look of a man who had just discovered he had more left than he thought. What do we do now? He said. We go to Caldwell, she said. We meet with Perch in person. We bring the deed, the original mortgage, the survey records, and the photographs I've made of the filled irrigation channel. We put it in front of him and we ask him to file a formal challenge to the boundary survey and a complaint regarding the usurious interest charges. Harlan will know. He has people everywhere in this county. Yes, Abigail said. He will know, and we need to move faster than he can respond. Silas looked at her for a moment, the hammer still in his hand, the afternoon sun coming at a low angle across the yard and picking out the gray in his beard. You came here 2 weeks ago with a trunk and a skillet, he said. And a notebook, she added. Don't forget the notebook. And now you're telling me we might be able to save this ranch. I'm telling you the legal basis exists to challenge what's being done to you. Whether we can save the ranch depends on how fast we move, how well Perch works, and whether the court in this territory is honest enough to follow the law. She met his eyes. I think it is, but I don't make promises about things I can't control. He nodded slowly. When do we leave for Caldwell? Monday morning, she said. That gives me the weekend to organize everything Perch will need. She turned back toward the house. The late afternoon light lay across the yard and the field beyond it, golden and flat, touching the top of the garden plot she had cleared and planted, reaching the fence line she had walked, passing over the ground that someone had tried to steal 1 careful inch at a time. "Abigail," Silas said. She stopped. "I don't know how to—" He stopped himself. Started a different way. "You didn't have to stay. When Otis left, you could have gone with him, found something else." She considered that for a moment. "This ranch can be saved," she said. "Someone needed to notice that." She paused. "You noticed it too. You just needed someone to look at the same thing with different eyes." She went into the house. Behind her, she heard him go back up the ladder, and the sound of the hammer resumed. Steadier than before, she thought, though she was aware that might just be what she wanted to hear. She spread her documents on the kitchen table and got to work. The road to Caldwell took 4 hours by wagon, and Abigail spent most of them reviewing documents. She had organized everything into a single leather satchel that Silas had found in the back of his office closet. An old thing, cracked at the corners, that had probably belonged to Martha's father. Inside it, she had placed the original deed with the boundary description, the mortgage instrument, and all its amendments. Perch's letter, her own notebook with the measurement records from the boundary walk, the drawings she had made of the filled irrigation channel, and 3 pages of calculations showing the illegal interest charges year by year. She had also placed in the satchel a letter she had received 2 days ago from the Territorial Land Office in Wichita. It was short, written in the careful bureaucratic language of a clerk who had been asked to confirm something he found mildly uncomfortable. It confirmed that the survey update filed 3 years ago for the Boone property in Harlan County had been submitted by a firm called Meridian Survey Associates. It confirmed that the filing had been accepted as routine. It did not include the name of the individual surveyor, which meant she would have to ask for that separately, but it did include one detail she had not anticipated. The filing fee for the survey update had been paid by Harlan Land and Lending Company on the same date it was submitted. Harlan's company had paid to update a survey on someone else's property, a survey that moved that property's boundary in Harlan's favor. She had read that sentence 4 times before she let herself believe it was as significant as it appeared. Silas was driving. He had been quiet since they left the ranch at first light, a different kind of quiet than his usual, not withdrawn but focused, as if he were conserving something. He had put on his better coat, the one with the buttons that were all still attached. She had noticed that without saying anything about it. "There's one thing I need to know before we meet with Perch," she said, without looking up from the document she was reviewing. "What's that?" "Is there anyone in this county who would testify against Harlan? Anyone who has had a similar arrangement with his company and been willing to say so?" Silas was quiet for a moment. The wagon moved over a rough section of road, and the satchel slid on the bench seat between them. She caught it without thinking. "There's a man named Duval," Silas said. "Tom Duval. Had a place 15 miles east near the creek bend. Lost it 2 years ago. He said at the time the numbers didn't add up, but nobody listened to him." "Where is he now?" "Renting a room above the feed store in Caldwell. Works odd jobs." Abigail wrote the name in her notebook. "Is he honest?" "Tom Duval is one of the most honest men I've ever met," Silas said, which is probably part of why he lost his land. He couldn't believe what was happening to him until it was done. "Would he talk to us?" "He'd talk to me," Silas said. "Don't know about you." "That's fine," Abigail said. "You talk to him." Gerald Perch's office was above a hardware store on Caldwell's main street, accessed by a staircase that smelled of sawdust and machine oil. Perch himself was a narrow man of about 50 with a precise, watchful quality about him. The kind of attorney, Abigail assessed quickly, who was not impressive in a courtroom, but was very good in a room with documents. Exactly what she needed. He looked at the satchel she set on his desk. He looked at her. He had the brief evaluating look of a man revising his expectations. "You're the one who wrote me," he said. "Yes. I expected—" He stopped himself. "Never mind. Let's see what you have." They spread everything across his desk. Perch worked through it methodically, which was how Abigail had hoped he would work. He did not jump to the interesting parts, but read everything in sequence, occasionally making small sounds under his breath that communicated something she could not decode. Silas sat in the chair against the wall and said nothing, which was the right decision. When Perch reached the Territorial Land Office letter, the one confirming that Harlan's company had paid the filing fee for the survey update, he stopped. He read it again. He took off his glasses, cleaned them on his vest, put them back on, and read it a third time. "Where did you get this?" he said. "I wrote to the land office and asked for the filing records," Abigail said. "It's a public document." "I know it's a public document," Perch said. He said it without irritation, more with the tone of a man making a note to himself. "I'm asking because in 12 years of practicing law in this territory, I have never seen anyone think to ask for it." He set the letter down with great care, the way you set down something fragile. "Do you understand what this is?" "It's evidence that Harlan's company initiated and paid for a boundary survey on a property it did not own," Abigail said, which, combined with the fact that the survey moved the boundary in a direction that benefited Harlan's water rights position and was never disclosed to the property owner, establishes both the mechanism and the motive for fraudulent survey manipulation. Perch looked at her for a long moment. "What did you do before you came to Harlan County, Miss Mercer?" "I managed accounts for a dry goods store in Salina," she said. "They wasted you," he said, and went back to the documents. He spent another 40 minutes working through everything. He asked Abigail questions, precise, useful questions about the measurements she had taken, the depth of the fill in the irrigation channel, the vegetation growth she had used to estimate the timeline. He asked Silas about the history of the water usage, when the lower pasture had gone dry, whether any of Harlan's people had been on the property in the period she had identified. Silas thought about that last question. "There was a man who came by about 3 years ago," he said slowly. "Said he was from the county assessor's office, wanted to walk the property line to update the tax assessment. I let him." Perch wrote something down. "He wasn't from the county assessor's office," Perch said. "Or if he was doing 2 jobs that day." He capped his pen. "Here is where we are. You have a legitimate usury claim on the mortgage. That's the clearest piece, and I can file it within the week. The survey fraud is more complex. To challenge the survey officially, I need a new survey from a licensed independent surveyor who is not affiliated with Harlan's network, which in this county is a shorter list than it should be. I know a man in Dodge City. He's expensive." "How expensive?" Silas said. Perch told him the figure. Silas said nothing, but his jaw tightened. "I have $42, Abigail said. "That covers approximately half." Both men looked at her. "I'm prepared to put it in," she said. "If we win the usury claim, the court will recalculate the debt, and there will be funds to recover. I want that accounted for formally." Perch looked at her and then at Silas. "She's right that the usury recovery would likely cover it, if the court accepts the calculation." "File the usury claim first," Abigail said. "That establishes the pattern of overreach. It makes the survey fraud claim easier to believe." "That's a tactical opinion," Perch said. "Yes," she said. "Is it wrong?" A pause. "No," he said. "It's not wrong." They found Tom Duval at the feed store, as Silas had predicted, sweeping out the back with the methodical, unhurried movements of a man who had made a separate peace with reduced circumstances. He was maybe 55, thick through the chest, with a gray beard trimmed close, and eyes that were still sharp even if the rest of him had gone soft at the edges. He looked at Silas, and his face did something complicated. "Silas Boone," he said, "you still have your place." "For now," Silas said. "That's what I need to talk to you about." They sat in the alley behind the store on a stack of empty crates, Abigail a few feet apart to give them room, close enough to hear. Duval told his story in the flat, careful way of a man who had told it before to people who hadn't done anything about it. The same pattern, the note that ended up with Harlan's company, the interest that grew faster than he could pay it, the survey update he never authorized, the foreclosure that had come so fast it had left his wife crying in the yard while they loaded the wagon. "The water," Abigail said. She had not planned to speak, but she couldn't stop herself. "Was there water on your property that ran off it after the boundary changed?" Duval looked at her for the first time. "Creek ran through the east side," he said. "After the foreclosure, Harlan's company ran a new channel, put it through their land to the south." He paused. "I always wondered about that. Why they cared so much about my little piece." "Because your little piece had water," she said, and his operation to the south is dry without it." The silence that followed had a particular quality to it, the silence of a man hearing an explanation for something that has been sitting wrong in him for 2 years. "How many others do you think there are?" Silas said. Not quite to Duval, not quite to Abigail. A question he was asking the air. "I don't know," Abigail said, "but I know how to find out." She had written another letter the previous week to the county register's office requesting the list of properties where survey updates had been filed in the last 5 years. She had not yet received a response, but she expected one within 10 days. What she expected to find in it she had not shared with Silas, because she didn't want to give him a number she wasn't sure of yet. But she was beginning to understand that the thing she was looking at was not a scheme aimed at one struggling rancher. It was a system. Duval agreed to speak with Perch. He stood up and squared his shoulders in a way that looked like something being remembered, an old posture reassembled. "I'll say what happened," he said. "I should have said it 2 years ago. Didn't think anyone would listen." "Someone's listening now," Silas said. They walked back through Caldwell's main street to arrange the meeting with Perch, and Abigail watched the town around her with the same quiet, systematic attention she brought to everything. She noticed the Harlan Land and Lending Office on the east side of the street, a substantial building, newly painted, with a glass window that had the company's name lettered in gold. She noticed the way 2 men standing on the hardware store step tracked their small group as they passed. She noticed that one of the men went inside when they turned toward Perch's staircase. She did not say anything about this to Silas, but she noted it. Victor Harlan came to the ranch on a Wednesday. Abigail was in the garden when she heard the horses, 2 of them, coming up the track at a pace that suggested the riders considered themselves people who didn't need to announce themselves before arrival. She straightened up and turned. She did not go inside. She stayed where she was. Harlan was a man who had been handsome once and had aged into the particular kind of authority that money and uncontested power produce in a certain type of man. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair and a good coat, and the easy, settled quality of someone who had been the most important person in every room he'd entered for 30 years. The man behind him was younger, harder looking, and served obviously as both assistant and warning. He looked at Abigail with the same assessing look she had received from many men in her life, with the same conclusion in it. She was not the thing he had come to deal with. "I'm looking for Silas Boone," he said. "He's in the barn," she said. She didn't move. "Can I help you with something?" He looked at her with mild, amused surprise, the way a man looks at an obstacle he finds beneath his concern. "I'd rather speak with the property owner." "Then I'll let him know you're here," she said. "May I ask your name?" He told her his name the way a man says his name when he expects it to do something, to change the temperature of the conversation, to rearrange the other person's posture. She received it without any of those responses. "Wait here," she said, and walked to the barn. Silas looked up when she came in. She kept her voice level. "Victor Harlan is in the yard." He straightened very slowly. He set down what he was holding. His jaw went tight. "You don't have to say anything," she said quickly. "Let me talk." "Abigail, I mean it. You own this property. You are the party of record, but you let me handle this. If he gets what he wants from you today, we lose the tactical position Perch spent 2 weeks building." She held his eyes. "Trust me." A long moment. His jaw was still tight. "All right," he said, "but I'm standing there." "Good," she said. "That's exactly right." They walked out together. Harlan's eyes moved between them with the rapid adjustment of a man recalculating. He had expected to deal with a struggling debtor alone. The woman was still there, and now she was standing beside the property owner with the settled quality of someone who belonged. "Mr. Boone," Harlan said, "I wanted to come personally to discuss your account. I understand there's been some correspondence with an attorney in Caldwell." "There has," Silas said. He said nothing else. Abigail had asked him to say as little as possible, and he was, with visible effort, doing that. "These legal challenges can get expensive," Harlan said. His tone was the tone of a man explaining something to a person he felt sorry for. "And they rarely succeed. I've come to offer you a settlement arrangement. Extended repayment schedule. Reduced monthly obligation. I think you'll find it very reasonable." Abigail spoke. "What interest rate are you proposing for the extended schedule?" Harlan looked at her with the full attention of a man deciding whether a thing is worth engaging with. I'm sorry. Who exactly are you? Abigail Mercer. I manage Mr. Boone's accounts. She kept her hands at her sides. What interest rate are you proposing? That would be discussed in formal terms, because the current rate, as you're aware, exceeds the territorial limit by 9 percentage points, she said. Any extended schedule that continues to apply the existing rate would compound an existing statutory violation. I'd want that on record before any settlement discussion proceeded. The temperature in the yard changed. It was subtle. A slight shift in Harlan's posture, a small tightening around the younger man's eyes behind him. Wherever did you study law? Harlan said. The amusement was still in his voice, but it had changed quality, gone thinner. I don't need to study law to read a statute, Abigail said. Anyone can read a statute. That's rather the point of publishing them. Harlan looked at Silas. I'd strongly recommend you resolve this quietly, Silas. Courts in this territory take a long time. You have a foreclosure hearing in less than 3 months. Whatever your... A brief pause, surveying Abigail again. Advisor thinks she's found in those old documents. The timeline is not your friend. Mr. Harlan, Abigail said. He looked back at her, and this time he gave her his full attention, the kind a man gives when he's stopped underestimating something. We have the land office record showing that your company paid the filing fee for the boundary survey update on this property 3 years ago. We have the original deed description, which places the eastern boundary 38 yards northeast of where your survey put it. We have a licensed independent surveyor arriving from Dodge City in 10 days. And we have a witness who experienced an identical boundary adjustment on a neighboring property that your company subsequently acquired. The silence was complete. Harlan's face did not change dramatically. He was too experienced for that. But something happened behind his eyes. A rapid, contained calculation, the kind that happens when a man who has always set the terms of a thing suddenly finds that someone else has been reading the contract. You have quite the imagination, he said. I have quite the filing system, she said, which, in my experience, is more useful. He looked at her for a long moment. The morning sun was directly behind her, and she wondered if that bothered him. She hoped it did. Good day, Mr. Boone, he said. He did not address her again. He turned his horse, and the younger man followed, and they went back up the track at the same confident pace they'd arrived at, because a man like Harlan was not going to let anyone see him leave in a hurry. Silas waited until they were out of sight. Then he let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. He's going to move fast now, he said. Yes, Abigail said. So are we. She had already turned back toward the house. Inside, on the kitchen table, was her notebook. There were more letters to write before the day was over, and a meeting with Perch scheduled for Friday, and the county register's response about the property survey list was overdue by 3 days. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed this with the same calm attention she brought to everything, noted it, accepted it, moved on. Behind her, she heard Silas following her into the house. He moved differently than he had 2 weeks ago, less like a man bracing against something, more like a man who had decided to face it. The trap was exposed. What happened next depended on how fast they could move before Harlan figured out how to close a new one. The county register's response arrived on a Thursday, 8 days after Harlan's visit to the ranch. Abigail was at the kitchen table when Silas came in with the mail packet from the road box, and she knew from the weight of the envelope before she opened it that the list inside was long. She had asked for all survey update filings in the county over a 5-year period. The clerk had complied without apparent awareness of what he was handing over, in the way that bureaucratic offices sometimes handed over things that mattered enormously because they were accustomed to no one caring about what they contained. She spread the list on the table. 14 properties. Survey updates filed over a period of 4 years, all of them processed through Meridian Survey Associates, all of them in the eastern and southeastern sections of Harlan County where the creek drainage systems ran. She checked each one against the filing dates. 9 of them had been paid for by Harlan Land and Lending Company. 9 properties. Not 1. Not 2. 9. She sat with that number for a long moment. Outside, she could hear Silas splitting wood at the side of the house, a steady, rhythmic sound that had become, over the weeks she had been here, part of the background of the place. She had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the sound of wind. She got up and went to the door. Silas. The splitting stopped. He came around the corner with the axe still in his hand. She held up the list. He did this to 9 properties, she said. Not just yours, not just Duval's, 9. He crossed the yard and took the list from her. He read down it slowly. She watched his face move through several things. Recognition of names, the arithmetic of what 9 properties meant, and then something harder and flatter that settled at the bottom. The Aldrich place, he said. Ed Aldrich lost his property 2 years ago. His wife took the children back to her family in Missouri. He's been living in a dugout on the Cheyenne Road. He moved down the list. The Kellerman brothers. They lost theirs last spring, blamed themselves for the debt. He looked up. They blamed themselves, Abigail. I know, she said. This needs to go to more than Perch. I know that too. She had been thinking about it since she first saw the list, working out the right sequence. Perch handles the legal filings for the Boone property specifically. The larger pattern needs to go to the Territorial Land Commissioner and to a newspaper. Silas looked at her. A newspaper. The Wichita paper covers territorial land issues. If this story runs before the foreclosure hearing, Harlan loses the quiet he needs to operate. Courts pay attention to public record. He'll come after you for it. He can't do anything about a public filing at the land commissioner's office, she said. And he can't do anything about a reporter asking questions. Both of those things are legal and available to anyone. She paused. He's counting on people not knowing they have options. That's the whole scheme. Take away that advantage and he has considerably less power than he appears to. Silas handed the list back to her. He looked at the axe in his hand as if he had forgotten it was there, then set it against the house wall. You know what I keep thinking, he said. I keep thinking about the Kellerman brothers sitting somewhere right now thinking they failed, that it was their fault. Then we make sure they find out it wasn't, Abigail said, and they find out before this is over, not after. The surveyor from Dodge City arrived on a Saturday. His name was August Vale, a compact, serious man of about 45 who traveled with a level, a transit instrument, and a canvas roll of reference maps that he treated with more care than most men treated their horses. He had been recommended by Perch and had, Perch informed them, testified as an expert witness in 3 previous boundary dispute cases in the territory, winning 2 and settling the 3rd on favorable terms. He walked the entire eastern boundary line with Abigail and Silas, and he worked with the slow, careful deliberateness of a man who understood that his measurements would be examined by people who wanted to find fault with them. He checked and rechecked. He consulted his reference maps. He spent 40 minutes alone at the northeast corner with his equipment while Abigail and Silas waited at a distance. When he came back, he did not make them wait. The iron post is 22 inches southwest of the true corner as established by the original government survey grid, he said. I'll need to verify that against the Federal Land Office records in Wichita, which I can do by correspondence within the week. But based on what I've measured today, your deed description is accurate, and the updated county survey is not. He said it the way he said everything, without drama, a simple fact, which was exactly how Abigail wanted it in a court document. And the irrigation channel, she said. He had walked that too. He crouched and examined the filled section for longer than she had expected, digging into the fill at the edges with a small tool he carried, checking the soil layering. That was filled deliberately, he said. The soil profile is wrong for natural silting, and there's a layer of clay about 8 inches down that was brought from somewhere else. The native soil here doesn't have that composition. He straightened up. I've seen this before. It's a common method for redirecting water flow without obvious surface evidence. Can you say in writing when it was done? Abigail said. Approximately. The vegetation growth gives me a range of 2 to 4 years. I can narrow that with more analysis if you need it. The narrower the better. Vale looked at her with the mild collegial respect of someone recognizing a particular kind of mind. I'll give you everything the evidence will support and nothing it won't, he said. That's how I work. That's all I'm asking, she said. The letter to the Territorial Land Commissioner went out that Monday, written by Perch, but organized from Abigail's documentation. It was 17 pages, including exhibits: the Boone property deed, Vale's preliminary survey findings, The county register's list of 9 properties with Harlan filing fees attached, Tom Duvall's signed statement about his own experience, and Abigail's calculation document showing the illegal interest charges. Perch had looked at the full package before it was sealed. "I filed a lot of complaints in this territory," he said. "I've never filed one this well documented." "Does it matter?" Silas asked. He was sitting across from Perch's desk, and he had the look of a man who had been cautiously building hope for 2 weeks, and was aware of how much that hope would cost him if it fell. "Yes," Perch said, "enormously. A complaint with gaps gets lost. A complaint this specific requires a response." He looked at Abigail. "The commissioner's office will have to act on this or formally decline, and a formal declination on a file this solid becomes its own story." "How long until the foreclosure hearing?" Abigail said. 6 weeks, as of this morning. The hearing date was confirmed. 6 weeks. She did the calculation the way she always did calculations. Backward from the deadline, filling in what needed to happen in what order. "File the usury challenge in district court this week," she said. "The land commissioner complaint goes out today. The letter to the Wichita paper goes tomorrow. Vail's final report should be ready within 10 days, at which point we file the formal boundary challenge with the county surveyor's office." She paused. "And someone needs to contact the families on that list. Not all 9, the ones who still have their cases open. Anyone Harlan hasn't fully closed out yet." "There are 3 properties on the list still in active foreclosure proceedings," Perch said. He had been through the register list with the same careful attention Abigail had. "Aldrich and 2 others. "Those families need to know what we know," Abigail said. "They may have documents we don't have. They may be able to corroborate the pattern in ways that strengthen all of the cases." "I can reach them," Silas said. Both of them looked at him. He had been quiet while they worked through the sequence, listening in the way he listened when he was deciding something. "I know all of those families. I'll go personally." Abigail looked at him for a moment. 3 weeks ago, Silas Boone had been a man navigating his life inside an ever-tightening circle of debt and diminishing options, moving from task to task with the distracted energy of someone who had stopped believing the work would change anything. The man sitting in Perch's office now was not that man. He was still angular and weathered and not much for words, but the thing that had been absent was present again. "Go," she said. "Take the list. Tell them about Perch. Tell them to gather every document they have." He nodded and stood, and Abigail thought that in some other story, in some easier version of this situation, that would have been the kind of moment that called for something sentimental. But this was not that kind of story, and they did not have time for sentiment, and she appreciated that Silas understood that without being told. The Wichita paper ran a story in 3 weeks. Abigail had written the reporter, a man named Clark, who covered territorial land and water issues. A 5-page letter laying out the pattern with specificity, the 9 properties, the survey dates, the filing fees, the illegal interest charges, the channeled water. She had not asked him to take her word for any of it. She had attached documentation for each claim. Clark had ridden to Caldwell and spent 2 days talking to Perch and Duvall and 2 of the other affected families that Silas had contacted. He had then ridden to Harlan's offices and asked for a comment, which Harlan's attorney had provided in careful legal language that said nothing. The story ran on a Friday under a headline that did not name Abigail, which she had expected, and named Victor Harlan directly, which she had hoped for. It described the survey manipulation scheme in plain terms that any reader could follow. It mentioned the territorial land commissioner complaint. It mentioned the district court usury filing. Silas read the paper at the kitchen table without saying anything for a long time. Then he folded it and set it down and looked at her. "Harlan's going to know you wrote to the paper," he said. "Yes." "He'll try to find a way to pressure you." "He can try," she said. She was at the stove making coffee, and she did not turn around. "What can he actually do? I haven't broken any law. I've filed public documents and answered a reporter's questions, that's all. He has money and people and connections in this county going back 30 years. He had a scheme going back several years that nobody documented," she said. "Now somebody has." She poured the coffee and turned around. That's the difference, not who has more power, who has more information and is willing to use it. He looked at her with an expression she had started to learn, the expression he wore when he was thinking something he wasn't sure how to say. "What?" she said. "I'm trying to figure out how I would have managed any of this without you," he said, "and I can't." She set his coffee on the table and sat down across from him. "You would have lost the ranch," she said. It was the plain truth, and she said it plainly. "Not because you're not capable, because you were inside it. You can't see the shape of a trap from inside it. And you could because you came from outside. Because I came from outside. And because I had nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. And because I'm stubborn about things that seem wrong." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "Don't make it more than it is." "I think it's quite a lot," he said. She looked at him across the table. The lamp was burning between them. Outside the window, the prairie was dark, and the wind was doing the same thing it always did, moving through the grass in that low, persistent voice. "Drink your coffee," she said. "We have the district court date next week, and I want to go through the interest calculation one more time before Perch presents it." He smiled. It was not a large smile. Silas Boone did not do things largely. But it was real, and she noted it the way she noted things that mattered, without making a fuss about noting them. The district court hearing on the usury claim was held on a Tuesday morning in a room that smelled of old wood and pipe tobacco and the specific institutional gravity of a space where decisions had been made for a long time. Harlan was there with his attorney, a man from Wichita who was expensive in a way that showed in the cut of his coat. They sat at the respondents' table with the confident stillness of people who expected the institutional gravity to work in their favor, as it generally had. Perch presented the usury claim in exactly the sequence Abigail had organized: the original mortgage rate, the amendment rate, the territorial statute, the calculation of excess charges year by year. He presented it without oratory and without unnecessary elaboration, which was precisely the right choice in front of a judge who had been practicing law for 30 years and had no patience for theater. Harlan's attorney argued that the interest rate was within negotiated terms agreed to by the debtor. He argued that the amendment constituted a separate agreement superseding the original terms. The judge asked to see the amendment document. He read it for 3 minutes in silence. He asked Perch a question about the statutory definition of usury as it applied to amended mortgage instruments. Perch answered from memory, citing the specific section and subsection. The judge looked at Harlan's attorney. "Do you have a counterargument to the statutory citation?" A pause. "We would request additional time to research the specific application. I've been looking at this statute for 20 years, the judge said. The application is not ambiguous. He made a note. I'm finding for the petitioner on the usury claim. The excess interest will be recalculated and stripped from the outstanding balance. Petitioner's attorney will submit the corrected figure within 14 days, and the respondent will have 7 days to object on computational grounds only." He looked up. "The foreclosure proceeding is stayed pending the debt recalculation." It was over in the time it took to say it. Abigail sat in the gallery behind Perch's table and felt something release in her chest. Not relief exactly, because the ranch was not yet fully safe, and the boundary challenge was still pending, and she was not someone who celebrated before the work was done. But a loosening. The acknowledgement that the first wall had come down. Silas was sitting beside her. He had not moved since the judge spoke. She looked at him. His eyes were wet. He was not crying. It had not tipped into that. But there was moisture at the corners of his eyes that he was not doing anything about, just sitting with it. She did not say anything. She put her hand on his arm for a moment, briefly, and then she took it back and looked forward, because neither of them were people who made prolonged moments out of things. Perch turned from the table with the measured satisfaction of a man who had done good work and knew it. Outside the courthouse, in the thin October light, Harlan's attorney walked past them toward a waiting carriage without looking at any of them. Harlan himself was behind him, and he did pause, briefly, barely, and looked at Abigail. Just looked, no words. She met his eyes without expression. He got into the carriage. "It's not over," Silas said, watching the carriage go. "No," Abigail said. "The boundary challenge is still pending. Vale's report goes to the county surveyor next week, and Harlan will contest it. And the land commissioner is still reviewing the larger complaint. She started walking. But today we took 40% of an illegal debt off your books. Today the foreclosure is stayed. She paused. Today is a day where the right thing happened. You're allowed to say that. He fell into step beside her on the courthouse steps. The street of Caldwell spread out before them, ordinary and unheroic in the autumn light. You're allowed to say it too, he said. She considered that. All right, she said. Today, the right thing happened. They walked back to the wagon, and the work that remained waited for them, patient and substantial, the way all important work waits. Not finished, not easy, but possible. Which Abigail had learned a long time ago was all you ever really needed. August Vale's final survey report arrived on a Wednesday, 14 days after the district court hearing, and it was everything Abigail had asked for and a few things she hadn't thought to ask for. Vale had done the federal land office verification he'd mentioned, cross-referencing the original government survey grid from the 1860s against the current county records, and had found not just the 22-inch discrepancy at the Boone property's northeast corner, but a consistent methodology across 4 of the 9 properties on the county register list. The same technique, the same directional shift, the same slight movement of boundary markers that individually looked like surveying error and collectively looked like what it was. He had written his report in the careful, unadorned language of a man who understood that precision was its own argument, and he had attached 11 pages of technical documentation that would have taken most people 3 readings to understand, but that Abigail worked through in a single sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her. She sent it to Perch the same day with a cover note. File the boundary challenge immediately. Don't wait for Harlan to make another move. Perch filed on Thursday. Harlan's attorney filed an objection on Friday, which Abigail had expected. What she had not fully anticipated was the nature of the objection. Rather than challenging Vale's methodology, which would have been difficult given the federal cross-reference, Harlan's attorney argued that the boundary question was a separate matter from the mortgage dispute and that the court lacked jurisdiction to consider both simultaneously. It was, she recognized, a delay tactic. Not a strong one, but delay was what Harlan needed now. The land commissioner's office in Wichita had sent a letter acknowledging receipt of the complaint and indicating an investigator would be assigned. The Wichita paper story had been picked up by 2 smaller territorial papers. The quiet that Harlan's operation depended on had been broken, and he was trying to slow everything down long enough to find a new way to manage it. Abigail wrote Perch a response to the objection before he had even asked her to. She laid out the jurisdictional argument in plain terms. The boundary determination directly affected the water rights that were central to the property's assessed value, which was the basis of the mortgage dispute, which made the 2 questions inseparable as a matter of law. She cited 2 territorial court precedents she had found in a legal digest Perch had lent her 3 weeks earlier that she had read cover to cover on the evenings when the other work was done. Perch read her draft, changed 4 words, and filed it as his own argument. The jurisdictional objection was denied. The boundary hearing was set for the 2nd week of November, 6 weeks after the usury ruling. In the time between, 3 things happened that Abigail had worked toward, and 1 thing happened that she hadn't planned for at all. The first was that Ed Aldrich's foreclosure case was stayed pending review of the larger land commissioner complaint. Perch had filed a motion connecting Aldrich's situation to the documented pattern, and the judge, a different judge from the usury case, older and more cautious, had agreed that common facts across multiple cases warranted consolidated review. Aldrich had come to the ranch in person to tell them. He was a thin man with the look of someone who had not slept properly in 2 years, and he stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and said to Abigail directly, which surprised her, "I heard it was you who found all of it. I want you to know what that means." She didn't know what to do with that kind of thing. She said, "I'm glad it helps," and meant it, and moved on before it could become something she had to carry. The second thing was that Tom Duvall filed his own claim against Harlan's company for the wrongful foreclosure on his property. He had found, with Perch's help, that the statute of limitations had not yet run, and that the documented pattern of fraud strengthened his individual case considerably. He had walked into Perch's office on a Tuesday morning, Perch reported, with the straightened shoulder posture of a man who had decided something, and said, "Tell me what I need to sign." The third thing was that the Territorial Land Commissioner's investigator arrived in Harlan County in late October. A quiet man from Wichita who asked precise questions and wrote down every answer in a small notebook. He spent 4 days reviewing county records, visited the Boone property to examine the irrigation channel and the boundary markers, and met with Perch and 2 of the other affected families. He did not tell anyone what conclusion he was drawing, but he requested a complete copy of Abigail's documentation package, and Perch told her afterward that investigators who intended to find nothing did not generally request complete documentation packages. The fourth thing, the one she hadn't planned for, happened on a quiet Sunday evening in late October. She had been outside checking on the winter wheat she had planted in September. It was coming up thin but even, green stitching across the dark-turned soil, and she had crouched down to look at it in the last light of the day with the particular satisfaction of someone seeing a thing they committed to beginning to become real. She heard Silas come out of the house and stop on the porch. She heard him come down the steps and cross the yard. He stopped a few feet from her. She straightened up and looked at him. He had the expression he wore when he was working up to saying something, a particular tension around his jaw, eyes directed slightly away from her face. "There's something I want to ask you," he said. She waited. "I want to know if you intend to stay," he said. "After all of this is settled, I want to know if this is a job you're finishing, or if you intend to stay." She looked at him in the fading light. The prairie stretched away on all sides of them, pale gold in the October evening, enormous and indifferent in the way it always was. The wheat was coming up at her feet. She thought about Selena and the store and the room above the dry goods where she had slept for 10 years. She thought about the letter she had written to Randall Holt and the way she had carried it inside her coat. She thought about the road and Otis and the moment she had climbed back into the wagon and said, "Take me somewhere else." "I planted that wheat," she said. "I intend to see it come up." Silas looked at the wheat. He looked at her. "That's not a complete answer." "No," she said. "It's not." She held his gaze. "I intend to stay." He nodded. He didn't say anything else right away, and she didn't need him to. What existed between them was not the thing she had imagined when she was writing letters to Randall Holt. It was not the neat arrangement she had planned for, the practical partnership that would fill practical needs. It was something that had grown sideways and unplanned out of difficulty and proximity and the particular intimacy of fighting for the same thing together. It was imperfect in the way of real things, and she had learned too much about real things to wish it were otherwise. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They stood together in the field for a while longer, not saying much, watching the light go. Cha-cha-dit. The boundary hearing came on a cold Tuesday in November, the sky the flat white of a sky considering snow. The courtroom had a wood stove in the corner that was working hard against the draft from the high windows, and the room was fuller than Abigail had expected. She recognized 2 of the other affected families, and there were several people she didn't know who had the look of people with a stake in the outcome. Harlan was there again, with the same Wichita attorney and the same settled stillness. This time, however, the stillness looked slightly different. Less like confidence and more like the deliberate composure of a man who understood his position had changed and was not yet sure how much. Vail testified for 2 hours. He was as precise and unperformative on the stand as he had been in the field, answering questions in the same measured voice regardless of who was asking them. Harlan's attorney cross-examined him for 40 minutes and failed to find a methodological weakness, because there wasn't one. The federal survey cross-reference was the kind of evidence that was very hard to argue against, because it was grounded in records that predated Harlan's operation entirely. Perch called Abigail as a witness, which she had known was coming and had prepared for. She testified to the discovery of the survey update letter, the irrigation channel fill, and the county register list, presenting each piece of evidence as it was. Found through public record requests, verified through site observation, documented in the systematic way she had always documented things. She spoke clearly and without drama. Harlan's attorney asked her twice, in different forms, whether she had legal training, and twice she answered that she did not. The second time, she heard a small sound from the gallery that might have been one of the affected families, or might have been the general sentiment of a room watching a woman be asked the same dismissive question twice. The third time his attorney started a question that appeared to be heading toward the same place, The judge cut him off. "We've established she doesn't have legal training, counselor. She also doesn't appear to need any. Move on." The ruling came the following Friday, in writing, delivered to Perch's office. The boundary survey filed by Meridian Survey Associates was ruled invalid on the grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation of ownership authority. Harlan's company had no legal standing to commission a survey on property it did not own. The iron corner post was ordered removed and the original boundary as established by the deed description was restored. The water rights appurtenant to the creek crossing reverted to the Boone property in full. Perch sent a rider to the ranch with the document the same afternoon it arrived. Silas read it at the kitchen table. He read it twice, in the same way he had read the survey update letter all those weeks ago, carefully, making sure he understood it. But the expression on his face now was nothing like that day. That day, he had looked like a man discovering the shape of something bad. Today he looked like a man who had been holding his breath for a long time and had just been told he could stop. He set the document down. He looked at Abigail across the table. "It's done," he said. "The boundary is," she said. "The land commissioner review is still pending, and Duval's case, and the others." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "But this one is done." "Yes," she said. "This one is done." What followed the ruling did not happen all at once, because important things rarely do. Victor Harlan's operation did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. It came apart the way it had been built, in pieces, through process, in the patient machinery of documentation and legal procedure. The Land Commissioner's investigation concluded in January, finding sufficient evidence of systematic survey fraud to refer the matter to the Territorial Attorney General for prosecution. Harlan's land holdings in the county were frozen pending the investigation. His lending operation lost its operating license in February. Meridian Survey Associates, it emerged, had been a company with one principal surveyor, a man named Graves, who had done Harlan's work exclusively for 7 years in exchange for a fixed fee per boundary adjustment. Graves negotiated a reduced charge in exchange for testimony, and his testimony filled in the methodology of the scheme in detail that corroborated everything Abigail had reconstructed from the documents. Of the 9 properties on the county register list, 3 had been fully foreclosed and transferred before the investigation began. Those cases became the core of the criminal prosecution. The remaining 6, including the Boone property and Aldrich's, had their situations remedied through the court process. Illegal debt stripped, boundaries restored, water rights returned. Tom Duval's civil claims settled in April for a figure that let him put a payment on a small property near Caldwell, and he sent Abigail a letter about it that she kept, though she would not have explained easily why. Silas's property, with the corrected debt and the restored water, became workable in a way it had not been for years. The creek ran through the east pasture again in the spring, following the original channel that Abigail had found filled and documented and ultimately gotten cleared. Watching the water come back through was not the dramatic moment that people imagine when they think about the resolution of hard things. It was just water moving through a channel the way it was supposed to, doing quietly what water does, and she stood at the edge of it on a March morning with mud on her boots and a cup of coffee going cold in her hand and felt something she would have had difficulty naming. Not triumph, something quieter than that, the particular satisfaction of a thing set right. The winter wheat came up in April. Not the full yield it would produce in later years, because the soil was still recovering and the season had been uneven, but enough to matter. Silas brought in a hand for the spring work, a young man named Cass who was 17 and had the earnest diligence of someone who needed to prove himself, and mostly did. The cattle were doing better. The lower pasture with the restored water had come back to its proper grass growth, and 3 of the cows that had been thin and troublesome all winter put on condition in March and April as the grazing improved. These were not dramatic developments. They were the small, quantifiable signs of a place returning to health, and Abigail tracked them in her notebook with the same systematic attention she had brought to the crisis, because she had found that the discipline of paying attention did not need a crisis to justify it. Things worth saving were worth tracking. She and Silas married in May, in Perch's office in Caldwell, with Perch and Duval as witnesses. a brief and unsentimental ceremony that was conducted in 10 minutes and followed by supper at the hotel across the street. There were no flowers. She wore her better dress, the brown wool one she had brought in her trunk from Selena, and Silas wore the coat with all its buttons. Duval shook both their hands with great seriousness and then said to Abigail specifically, "You're the stubbornest person I've ever met, and I mean that as a compliment of the highest order." "I know you do," she said. "Thank you." It was not the marriage she had imagined when she answered Randall Holt's advertisement. She had imagined something else. Some version of a life that had resolved cleanly into shape, the way she had believed, when she was younger and her father's store was still open, and the future seemed like a country with a map. What she had instead was Silas Boone, who was difficult and quiet and not very good at saying things, but was steady in the way that mattered. And a ranch that was not beautiful or easy, but was alive and improving, and work that was real and had real consequences, and a place where she had made herself necessary by being exactly who she was. That was not nothing. In her experience, it was most of what there was. There is something worth saying about what Abigail Mercer was, and what she was not. She was not a hero in the way that word usually gets used. She did not arrive on a white horse. She did not make speeches. She did not win anything with a dramatic gesture at a crucial moment. She arrived in the back of a freight wagon beside a roll of fence wire with a cast iron skillet and a notebook and $42. And she did the next necessary thing, and then the next one, and then the one after that. She paid attention when no one else was. She asked for public records that anyone could have requested. She did arithmetic. She wrote letters. She was also not without cost in herself. She had given up the $42, which was everything she had, on a bet that the law would work. That bet had paid out, but she had placed it fully aware that it might not. She had put her name on documents in a county where a powerful man had every reason to make her regret it. She had stayed when the practical thing, the self-protecting thing, would have been to take Otis's wagon back to Selena and find a different plan. She stayed because the ranch could be saved and someone needed to see that clearly enough to act on it. That is a simpler explanation than most people find satisfying, but it is the honest one. What the people of Harlan County eventually understood, slowly, in the way that understanding usually moves, without fanfare, was that the thing that had undone a 7-year scheme was not force, not money, not connection. It was a woman with a notebook who refused to accept that things which seemed wrong were actually right just because powerful people insisted on it, who understood that most injustice survives not because it is undefeatable, but because the people it harms either don't know what they're looking at or have lost faith that looking closely will change anything. Abigail had not lost that faith, not because she was exceptional, but because she was stubborn and paid attention and had nowhere better to be. By the summer following the ruling, 2 families from neighboring properties had come to the ranch asking for help navigating their own document disputes. Smaller matters than the Harlan scheme, but real ones. Abigail helped them the way she helped everything, systematically, without drama, by looking carefully at what was there. She did not think of this as a legacy. She thought of it as the next thing to do. The wheat she had planted in September, the first planting, on that cold autumn morning when the ranch was still struggling and nothing was certain, came to full harvest in its 2nd year. Silas came in from the field that evening with a head of it in his hand, the grain full and tight, the stalk dry and ready. He set it on the kitchen table between them. She looked at it for a moment, then she picked up her notebook and wrote the yield estimate in the margin of the page where she had originally recorded the planting date, completing the entry the way you complete a sentence you began a long time ago. Outside, the creek ran through the east pasture. The cattle were in the lower field. Cass was singing something off-key near the barn, badly, without apparent self-consciousness. The ranch was not perfect. It would never be perfect. There would be dry years and hard winters and problems she hadn't thought of yet. That was the nature of a place that was alive. It kept presenting new difficulties, because that was what living things did. But it was standing. And it was hers, in the way that things become yours when you have fought for them with everything you had, and won not because the fight was fair, but because you refused to stop. That, in the end, is the only kind of winning the frontier ever offered anyone. Abigail Mercer Boone understood that. She had understood it since the moment she climbed back into Otis's wagon and said, "Take me somewhere else." Since that first act of refusing to let the road end where someone else had decided it should end. She closed her notebook. She got up to start supper. The wheat harvest waited on the table, solid and real and finally done.